I am not a game developer, but in the interest of becoming one, I'm working my way through this 20 games challenge, where you create games of increasing complexity in order to learn and practice game development. And instead of making a single game of each set, I'm making them all, and striving to complete all the stretch goals as well. This is how I have found myself recreating Space War, a game that should need no introduction. The game itself is quite simple, aside from one aspect: the opponent. On one hand, multiplayer. I didn't set this project up for multiplayer, and worse, I had to figure out how to make online multiplayer work. Something of a step up from previous games in the project. Bit of a silver lining though. By implementing online multiplayer, I'd have implemented multiplayer. Or in other, more sensible words, I didn't have to worry about local multiplayer at all. On the other hand, single player. Figuring out logic for the computer player was a whole other challenge. It's not as simple as, say, the paddle in Pong, which only needs to decide if it'll move up or down. Here, I needed to make this thing carefully maneuver the play area, hunting the player without just falling into the star. There was a lot to figure out for this game, and I had to start somewhere, so I started by looking into the part I was most concerned about: multiplayer. A bit of googling later, I found some videos that were rather helpful, and started making the actual game, specifically the play area and spaceships, so I could have something to which I could add multiplayer. First, the star in the center. It turned out to be more like a black hole or something, but anyway, it does two things. First, it is a source of gravity, as the instructions dictate. But it is also a thing players can collide with. What happens then? From what I can tell, the original Space War actually had two options players could switch between. Have the spaceship be destroyed, or warp it to the corner of the screen. I went with the second option, but regardless, the black hole is composed of three parts. First, there's an area covering the screen that applies gravity to things within it. Secondly, a small hitbox in the center for collision. Lastly, a particle effect to indicate that stuff gets drawn in, and a pretty neat looking one at that. After that, it was onto the spaceships. Made two recolors of the last game's spaceship so players could tell themselves apart, then threw some nodes together. The root of the ship is a character body for gravity purposes. Had to jump through a few hoops to make it work properly, but that's par for the course. Below that, there's 9 hitboxes for collision detection. I didn't use the same sub-viewport trick that made my asteroid screen wrap work, instead favoring the 8 copies approach, since there aren't many things in existence at once. Not much more to do at that point, since I was waiting until I started implementing multiplayer to implement stuff like shooting and game logic. So I just had to give the player the ability to turn, the ability to accelerate, particles for acceleration, the ability to slow down because, well, why not, and particles for slowing down that looked dangerously shield-like because I didn't have any better ideas to display slowing down. With that, it was time to begin work on something that I honestly wasn't sure I could pull off going into this: online multiplayer. I started with LAN multiplayer first, because that is technically online, and it'd be within my ability to test on my own. It was significantly easier than I originally expected, though I suppose following along with a video helps a lot. Even though I had to go beyond what gets explained to fully integrate things into a proper game, there was one major issue, however. So far, this project had only been playable in the browser. I figured if you had to download the games, no one would play. Also, I didn't know what all had to be done to properly export non-web builds of a game. However, when exporting for the web, there are limitations. Notably, networking is fairly restricted. There's a few ways of handling online multiplayer. You can go crazy and create your own TCP and UDP packets, but Godot has its own high-level multiplayer stuff in 3 varieties. There's eNet, which seems to be the main one, but isn't supported on the web. There's WebRTC, which requires a server to establish a connection. Lastly, there's WebSocket. It works on the web and doesn't require an external server, so theoretically it would work, but the fact that it only uses TCP means latency could be a problem. Not that it would matter, as only the client aspect of WebSocket works on the web, no hosting games from a browser. I overlooked that detail at first, causing me to spend way too long trying to make it work. Regardless, it was clear I needed to export builds of the project, targeting platforms other than the web. For Windows, changing the icon of the executable isn't as straightforward as one might hope, but it wasn't too bad either. Wasn't able to get Windows to trust my program though, but whatever. I also exported a Linux version since it didn't require doing anything fancy, but I haven't bothered testing it yet, so hopefully it works fine. In addition to exporting differently, I had to add in a few version-specific things. There's a quit button now, and a full screen toggle, both of which hide themselves on the web version. Once I had that settled, it was back to implementing multiplayer. I started putting things together, made it so the spaceships could shoot and be destroyed, whilst making sure things are synced between the host and client. Continuing to utilize networking tutorials, I implemented a list of servers, so you can choose who to play against if you somehow have multiple people playing on one network. This spelled the end of any hope that multiplayer would work on the web build, however. While before this point, one could technically have the web player join a hosting non-web player, the addition of a list of servers required doing some low-level networking stuff, making custom UDP packets, which web builds do not support, so no multiplayer at all on the web. Yay. Oh well. Gradually I started implementing stuff to transform this from a pair of controllable spaceships into an actual game. Made it so scores kept, a winner is decided, and added some neat little animations, which I should experiment with a bit more in the future. Made sure disconnection is properly handled, added a not paused menu, and finally add sound and particle effects, despite telling myself I wouldn't leave them until last this time. And suddenly, game is complete! With functioning LAN multiplayer, I uploaded the new builds of this project to itch, and readied myself for figuring out singleplayer. But there was yet one thought in the back of my head that I wanted to address first. Could I add real online multiplayer? In theory, the code would barely need to change. As I understood it, I'd basically just need to let users enter the IP address of whoever's hosting, and leave it up to the host player to figure out how to forward the necessary port. That would be far from ideal. But thankfully I stumbled upon a solution to that. One of the multiplayer tutorials had a flaw where an assumption of the player's network setup was hard-coded. If their network was different, it wouldn't work. It might have been overkill to fix this, but I wanted to do so nonetheless. This led me to look at UPnP, which does some fancy network interface stuff. This includes port forwarding, so players don't have to do it themselves. It causes a bit of lag, but it means actual online multiplayer was, honestly, a piece of cake to implement. I wasn't able to test it at first, but eventually I confirmed it does in fact work. This just left one last feature to be implemented: single player. This too can reuse all the multiplayer stuff from before, just with an offline multiplayer peer instead of eNet, and a fake second player. But how to handle what this computer player will do? For fairness' sake, the logic behind how their spaceship works is identical. Same acceleration, turn speed, etc. The only difference is that a player isn't pressing any keys, but rather a chunk of code decides what keys it will press. Figuring out how that should be decided was an intimidating prospect. But with some trial and error, I got to a point where it isn't too bad, I think. This part can actually be played in the browser, so let me know how well you think it plays. At this point, the game was finally, completely done. Overall, Space War was certainly an interesting project. I didn't reuse as much from Asteroids as I originally thought I would. It forced me to learn a few new things, online multiplayer in particular. It gave me an opportunity to further mess with other random things I should keep delving into, like themes and particles. However, I've been kinda neglecting stuff like pixel art, which I really should spend more time practicing. Nevertheless, it's time to move on to the next game. This time, no screen wrapping spaceships. Instead, I'll have to make a top-down racing game with multiple game modes, multiple layers, and once more, multiplayer. Certainly a lot to do, but it seems like each individual part of it shouldn't be too much trouble. Only one way to know for sure though, and that's working on it. Till next time. As I said last video, if you're also learning game development, comment something. I'd like to see what you're all working on, and I'm sure other viewers will too. Also, smile.